Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second panel on police reform. It follows last week's panel on police reform. The first part of that panel is actually up for those interested in watching it on the Graduate Center's YouTube channel. It was a fascinating discussion, so I obviously encourage people to look at it if you're interested in this topic. That panel and this panel as well is sponsored by the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs, the Graduate Center's Center for Urban Research, and the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. I'm Michael Jacobson. I'll be the moderator tonight. I'm the director of the Institute for State and Local Governance, also a professor of sociology at the Graduate Center. ISLG is a research and policy institute. We work on justice, reform, and other sort of essential state and local issues in New York City and over 60 cities and counties in the US. And please, if you're interested, check out our website. Let me spend a minute on the sort of context for this discussion as opposed to last week's discussion, and then I'll quickly go into how the panel will work and introduce the panelists. Last week, we had sort of a high-level discussion around community safety, the meaning of community safety, how we should think about it, define it, the role of police, community, civil society, structural racism, etc. Today, we're going to pivot to somewhat more of the what is to be done question. That is, given what we want to achieve in community safety, maximizing community and public safety, what is it we do in a very sort of realpolitik way, given the current politics and fiscal constraints? Right? How do we achieve and maximize everyone's safety in New York City and nationally to the extent it requires capacity building and civil society and communities? How do we do that? Where does the money come from? What's the role of enforcement and the police? That's the sort of discussion we want to have tonight and have everyone, the panelists in the audience, leave with some really concrete ideas. The way the panel will work is that our four panelists will each speak for about 5 minutes. After that, I'll sort of moderate a discussion among all of us for about 15 minutes or so. And then we'll spend the last 10 or 15 minutes taking questions from the audience, which you'll put in the question function on your screen. You might want to think about doing that at around 10 after 8 or so, because by then you'll have sort of heard most of the panelists. So let me do a very, very quick introduction. All these folks have incredibly long resumes and tons of experience, so I'm going to do a very short introduction, and then we'll get right into it. And I'm going to introduce people in the order in which they're going to speak. So our first panelists is Elizabeth Glazer. Liz is the founder of Vital City, which is a new venture that launched literally a week or two ago. And if you go to the website, which is vitalcitynyc.org, you'll see that it's a place where actionable ideas from the academy, government, and community that will strengthen New York City's social fabric can be found. Really interesting. Their inaugural report just launched a couple of weeks ago as well on closing Rikers Island that Liz and I actually co-authored. Our next panelist will be Ana Bermúdez. Ana is the New York City's probation commissioner. She's the first openly gay person, first Latina, and second woman to be appointed commissioner. She's been the commissioner since 2014, and she's actually been at the agency since 2010, since she directed the juvenile justice division before becoming the commissioner. And prior to that, Ana spent a lot of time in the Children's Aid Society and cases working on similar juvenile justice and criminal justice issues. Our third speaker is David Kennedy. David is a professor of Criminal Justice at John Jay College. He's also the director of the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay. Professor Kennedy and the National Network supports cities that implement strategic interventions to reduce violence, minimize arrest and incarceration, enhance police legitimacy, and strengthen relationships between law enforcement and communities. Finally, we have the Reverend Rubén Austria. Rubén is the founder and executive director of Community Corrections for Youth, which is a Bronx-based not-for-profit organization dedicated to empowering grassroots faith and neighborhood organizations that develop effective community-driven alternative to incarceration programs for youth. So thank you all so much for doing this. And Liz, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael, and really great to be here with everybody. I'm going to quickly share a screen. Hopefully this will actually work. Shoot. Share. Okay. All right. So I wanted to talk for just a couple of minutes about what's at stake and sort of what some of the nuts and bolts are. Because I think where we are is that we are at a point where there are two kind of models and ways of looking at safety that were really kind of brought to the fore and brought to the surface by the murder of George Floyd last May and the demonstrations that filled the streets of our country. In one model, safety really starts and is owned by the police and the criminal justice system. This is a very well-defined model. It has a kind of satisfying simplicity. Somebody commits a crime, you call the cops, they go to jail, even if we've learned that it's perhaps not quite that simple. It's very well built out. You call 911 for everything from a cat in the tree to shooting down the block. And we've started to default to the police for really everything, even things we think about as civic functions like running community centers, employment programs, graffiti cleanup. And as the demonstrations last summer reflected, it's also produced harm, especially in communities of color, which bore the brunt of enforcement and led to really deep cynicism and estrangement from the police and from government in general. The other model starts from civic strength. It's owned by residents. It's based on the notion that close-knit families and neighborhoods well supported by access to decent housing and education and well-maintained parks are really the bedrock to a thriving life. And a thriving life is what brings us safety. But this model is pretty amorphous, it's pretty undeveloped, it's pretty uncoordinated, even though there are enormous and promising pieces like the crisis management system, like the Brownsville Safety Alliance, like neighborhood stat that hopefully we'll talk about a little bit. So this civic is really what the Kerner Commission was talking about in 1968 after unrest spread across the country. And they asked, how do we move away from two societies, separate and unequal, black and white? And their answer was really massive investments in social infrastructure, all the things I mentioned before, decent housing and schools, et cetera. And since then, there's been enormous evidence that if civic strength is where you start, you iteratively require the force of the criminal justice system less and less. So here you have a neighborhood in the Bronx, which connected two parts of the neighborhood and was a place that residents were fearful of going. It could have been that cops patrolled it, or it could have been as the neighborhood decided that they would instead fill it with people and activity and other things like this. And over again, we've seen over the past decade or so, really good evidence about things that work that are not police. to help us build a thriving life. And I think my colleagues will talk about this on the panel, but here's sort of a list of all kinds of employment, all kinds of different therapy, all kinds of physical space changes, from lighting, night shut to New York City Housing Authority developments to other things. And this is incredibly important, particularly in New York City, which is a very, very segregated city. Here you see the neighborhoods where Black and brown New Yorkers are largely living. They're also where our poorest neighborhoods are. They are where distress is concentrated and intersected. This looks at employment and elementary school absenteeism, jail incarceration, but I could show you many of these, sadly, from asthma to everything else, that indicates how intersected these issues are. And these are also the neighborhoods that have borne the brunt of the violence. The green neighborhoods show you from 1990 to 2019 to 2020 that these are the top 10 neighborhoods that led the city in shootings, and they've remained essentially unchanged throughout that time, even though violence has reduced. And so we haven't built up this other system of sort of civic infrastructure, partly because we don't have it and we haven't invested in it, and partly because it's hard to wean ourselves from the default to the police, and the police do have an effect on crime. But the question is, compared to what else? And so this shows you two things. One, the heavy reliance on the criminal justice system, essentially between 2013 and 2020, the amount of money that we spent went up about 35%, while all the activity in the system, arrests, arraignments, the size of the jail population, dropped by half. And so I think it raises the question of how do we actually decide where we're going to invest, what we're going to invest in, and how do we pressure test every dollar to make sure we're buying the most safety, the most thriving life that we possibly can. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna. And
Thanks, Liz. Anna?
I'm muted, sorry. You would think by now. But no. Hold on, let me get my things here. Whoops. All right, so I want to start, and then my video. My goodness. Oh, it says the host has stopped my video. Oh, here we go. Okay, so sorry for the technical difficulties. Let me start by framing my remarks with saying that DOP operates from the premise that assets already exist in communities, so much like Liz was talking about in terms of a belief in the civic infrastructure component of our work, and that there's often untapped human and social capital in our communities, and that people are really an important part of this whole community safety process. The other framing that I want to do, it has to do with the definition of safety. I know this was discussed last week, but it's important for me to raise this again in terms. I think Jennifer Jones also put it very well, that safety is not just the absence of crime, but the presence of well-being through quality and meaningful opportunities and social cohesion. And that, there's frankly an abundance of this kind of safety in some communities. Again, just like Liz just showed, and a debilitating absence of such safety in other communities, primarily BIPOC and low income communities, which correlate also to very highly policed, communities. So to Michael's questions, what do we do about all this? One example is the DOP's NEON model of probation, which is almost exactly what Liz was speaking about. So perfect segue, Liz. So these are community hubs in 7 neighborhoods in New York City that have been historically and currently disproportionately impacted by the justice system, right? What's unique about this is that each has a local stakeholder group comprising residents, people who work in CBOs in the communities, business owners, clergy, people who used to be on probation, and probation staff. And this group makes decisions about program design, resource allocations, et cetera, right? For example, so when we are going to issue an RFP, we go to the stakeholder groups first, we get input, we get, what their perspective is on it. In some instances, like in neon arts and neon sports, they decide the focus of it. They've chosen fencing, for example, for a sports, cycle of investment. Also, the RFP process involves the applicants to go in front of the stakeholder groups to present their proposed project and show that they have the community ties necessary to get people in. All the programming is for community residents as well as for people on probation. And so this brings neighbors together, destigmatizes justice system involvement, and builds the social cohesion that we want to see. In other words, some community resilience. Now, this is not to say that we don't have an enforcement lever in our work. That has always been and will always be part of probation work, but it needs to be deployed strategically as we work with people in the process of engaging them, trust building, so that they're ready to take advantage of all the opportunities and services that we provide. So this model of "and" has resulted in very positive outcomes in the justice arena as well as in community well-being. In the justice arena, if you will, we now have 9 out of 10 people citywide successfully completing probation. Oh, and by the way, the slide that you had, Liz, on the budget going up, that's because we've gone from 3 contracts to 80 contracts within probation, and the amount of money that we are investing through the neons into the work that we're doing. So in the justice arena, we now have 9 out of 10 people successfully completing probation citywide. But what's most remarkable about that is that the people who report to neons and live in those communities also complete probation at that same rate. So these are the most challenged neighborhoods, and now probation success is not predetermined by your zip code. In addition, people under supervision at neons had lower rates of rearrest than the overall population on probation, even though, again, their neighborhoods are policed at much higher rates. Much of this is owed to our Arches Transformative Mentoring Program for 16 to 24-year-olds that are supervised in neons and are often at the center of violence in their communities. And the Arches mentoring programs, the groups are led by credible messenger mentors, and Arches has been now proven to decrease felony convictions by more than 2/3. Finally, in the community well-being arena, the neon infrastructure allows us to respond to community needs and requests in real time. Most notably, during the pandemic, we were able to scale up our neon nutrition kitchen operations and wound up feeding close to 500,000 people since March of 2020. And we even had then young people and community residents working with us, giving out food. That allowed us to provide also PPE to stakeholders to distribute. And also, as people were waiting in line for food, give all sorts of other social service opportunities. When SYEP was canceled, we quickly then put together the Neon Summer and worked with 20 community partners and served 2,700 young people. So basically, the Neon model is a public-private partnership that should be invested in and perhaps replicated in other agencies in the city to get some outstanding community safety outcomes. So with that, I will pass it to Professor Kennedy.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Liz. I'm so enjoying what I'm hearing today. It's so rational, it's so coherent, it's fundamentally positive, and it's completely detached from what I do every day. So the national network does applied violence prevention nationally and internationally. We're in about 40 cities around the country in the United States right now. Michael launched us by saying, this is realpolitik, what do we do? And what we see around the country is people have absolutely no idea how to step up to the question that we have been posed today. We are in a major violence crisis nationally. That violence is being felt in the places that were feeling it before. It was bad enough before, it's worse now. You know, Liz has sort of said, not to put words in her mouth, but there's a way to think about this. There are ways to chart our ways forward. There are ways to think about old approaches and new approaches and their associated strengths and weaknesses. There are pathways to different frameworks. Mentioned, a important list of interventions that have been meaningful. Anna talked about demonstrated models about how to do things differently and better, and that they're actually working. And I think what I want to say is that the policy discussions that I see at cities among elected and appointed officials and activists working on this are just nothing like what we have been hearing and talking about so far. In the last year, the police especially, but criminal justice, and I'd actually say the government, the state, has taken a major legitimacy hit. There's a significant chunk of the polity that now believes in something like abolition or defunding. They don't believe in these institutions anymore. They don't want them in their lives and the lives of their communities. I think that's the first time since abolition around slavery that the civil rights movement in this country has wanted out of an existing important democratic institution, right? People wanted suffrage, they wanted housing, they wanted education, they wanted into these democratic institutions. These are people saying, we don't believe in this institution anymore. And what we find is that the elected and appointed folks who have to make and implement these decisions and deal with the sorts of questions that Michael's posed to us, they are paralyzed. They are deer in the headlights. They can't figure out how to step up to this moment. I absolutely want to believe, and I think I do believe, as Liz has suggested, that there are fundamentally different ways of doing public safety. I don't see any of those ways that can happen quickly. So there's a fundamental sequencing and pacing disjunction between where we want to go on this and the fact that we have communities in crisis. The long-term enterprise here cannot respond to doubling and tripling of homicides, which is what we're seeing in again, already harmed neighborhoods all over the country. Frankly, I see elected and appointed people abdicating their responsibilities and looking at this awful mess and saying, well, the community knows what to do. The community can tell us how it wants to do public safety, which just means that people with resources and power and time and authority are not stepping up to try to figure out how to do this. They're offloading it to people who don't have any of those things and are already terrifically overstressed. And what we see around the country is frontline people grappling with these issues who are exhausted and traumatized and simply trying to get through their work day. And I don't know how we do better than this, right? The politics of this are paralyzing in a practical way at the city level right now. And as somebody who has committed my adult life to public safety and violence prevention, I feel sort of going back to some of the things that Liz and Anna said. We have learned a tremendous amount about how to do this better, right? The science and practice of public safety is way ahead of any place it's ever been. And our ability to actually do the work is worse than it's ever been.
Oops. Okay, thank you, David. I'm gonna turn it over to Rubén, maybe just a 10 seconds of moderator prerogative. I'm told I described Rubén's organization as community corrections for youth versus community connections for youth. I'd like to deny that I did that, but it's on tape, so that won't work. I just must have corrections on my brain, but I apologize for that, Rubén. Why don't you take us home, and then we'll have a discussion.
All right, thank you, Michael. Don't worry, it happens all the time. But it is a fundamental difference as we believe, especially that what young people, especially young people in the criminal justice system, need is connections and not corrections. But I guess I want to start by saying I think what the present moment is revealing probably more clearly than any time in my lifetime is that the institution of policing is kind of being unmasked as not something that is neutral, fair, just, right? It's more and more being seen as something that exists as a racialized system of social control that very much by design and by continued practice is keeping order in a place where the have-nots are policed, right, for the sake of the haves and everybody else. And we get into these kind of polar debates about, well, what do we need? And you hear a lot of we need both, and we need better policing, and we need better opportunities and more community. But I want to come back to something that I think really kind of undergirds this whole thing is that for the communities that Liz talked about, the communities of color that have always been economically disenfranchised, where all of the social conditions have been the worst, that there has been a call for neighborhood development, right, for justice in these communities for decades, and the calls have included at times stronger policing when crime has been overrun, but there's a demand for social justice. There's a demand for stronger policing. There's a demand for greater economic opportunity. And as James Foreman points out, I think very well in his book, that what communities of color in the United States have received for the past 50, 60 years has only been stronger policing. It's only been criminal justice interventions. And so as a result, we're not going to get anywhere with that. So what do we do, right? Do we defund the police? I believe so. I would like to see the police completely defunded. I'm also a realist that, I don't think that can happen tomorrow. What I want to focus on briefly is what can be done in the moment. And my organization in the South Bronx, we got our start when we just proposed, we said, let's take our neighborhood and we want to get young people who are right at the cusp of really progressing into more serious criminal justice involvement. And we talked to prosecutors, and we talked to police, and we talked to probation. And they kind of gave us this profile of young people who they said, these are kids who are like 14, 15, they're maybe on their second or third arrest. They're starting to escalate from, a fight to gang assault to a lower level robbery. And they said, and we've seen the trajectory that in the next 6 months to a year, these kids are going to be arrested on a gun robbery or on a gang assault or even on a shooting. Anyway, what we did was very simply just marshal the community resources, a bunch of grassroots small organizations. We said to the prosecutors, give us the kids, right? And we over a 2.5 year period, we worked with about 60 something young people. We got 95% of them through the program. And we did get some recidivism studies and saw that our young people compared to a comparison group were a third less likely to be rearrested the following year. I don't think that's the strongest result. I think the strongest result is one that often doesn't show up, which is about how both the young people stayed connected to community well beyond their mandates. Some of them wound up coming on staff with us and serving as mentors. What's not really included in these recidivism stats is how the community came together and started learning to support youth in more and more situations. And granted, these are young people who were not yet carrying guns, they were not yet shooting, but they were on the path to becoming that. What I want to share as well, doubling down on something Anna said, this Arches Transformative Mentoring Intervention, launched with 10 million from Bloomberg Philanthropies over 3 years, has resulted in incredible reductions in recidivism. Like Anna said, 2/3 recidivism reductions after a year as far as felony reconvictions. That effect still holding up 2 years later. And again, very promising result of relationships being formed between probation officers, formerly incarcerated mentors. I am less familiar with the cure violence world and the crisis management system, and I'm probably going to get stuff wrong, and there's probably people on this call who could correct me, but we know that where the CMS is in place, there's reductions in shootings. Liz spoke about the Brownsville Safety Alliance, 5 days without cops, without 911 calls. It worked. And so these things are all happening and they can work. Now, I think the problem is, right, with all of these things, is that none of these things are anywhere near to scale to actually solve the issues that we're talking about. And I was trying to do these budget comparisons. And in 2020, the NYPD budget was about 10.9 billion total. And I tried to compare that with the crisis management system, which is 36 million. And I think, as you could see, the line doesn't even show up on the graph, right? So 10.9 million to 36 million, no comparison. It's still producing results, but as David mentioned, the folks who are trying to do this are already overstressed, working on small budgets. And so I wanted to just see, could we play around with some numbers that might make this a little bit more comparable? In 2020, the NYPD's overtime costs alone were 860 million, right? So let's not even talk about necessarily defunding the police at the level of, are we going to cut staff or are we going to terminate positions? But what if you just took the overtime, right? What if you took 860 million compared with the 36 million that's in the crisis management system right now? And what if you made an actual effort, right? Not just to kind of drop piecemeal grants on these community efforts, which I believe are the answer, but to actually invest in an infrastructure in a sustainable way. And just playing around with these numbers, right? With an $860 million budget, currently there's 14 CMS sites at an average of maybe $2.5 million budgets. And I'm sure folks can correct me if I'm wrong. But, you know, I think what we're talking about is if you're actually going to have an impact on public safety, right, at the level of who is going out to meet the shooters, right, who is touching the hot spots. And I got to tell you that this stuff is happening right now, right? It's happening. And the sad thing is that it's often happening under the radar. And sadly, the people who are often doing it are saying, I can't, don't publicize it, because if we publicize it, it's going to get shut down. But I would put that money. I would put if you could jump up those 14 organizations into, let's say you made it 82 organizations and drop 10 million on them a year, right? That's something we've never, ever tried to do anything close to that. But Sharkey's research, right, has this, that you cannot find, I challenge anyone to find, like, can you find a consistent link between policing practice and crime? And you can't do it, right? You have stop and frisk and crime goes down, you take it away, it keeps going down, now we're going back up, right? It's not the policing practices that are affecting crime, but the more community organizations that you have that are dedicated to reductions in crime and violence, you are getting those reductions in the murder rate, you are getting those reductions in the violent crime rate. I would take that $10 million, or I would take that 86 million and spread it around 86 organizations and give them $10 million a year and do something on a scale we've never done, right? 3 million to hire maybe 30 violence interrupters. Most organizations have 3 or 4, right? But most precincts have 300 officers, 1 million on credible messenger mentors, a couple million on supported work. And we've actually seen these things that where you can get, if you could get a corporation to say, we're going to do a mass hiring, right, at UPS or FedEx, and there are actually gang leaders who will say, hey, if you could get my guys jobs, that's cool. Let them go straight. And, you know, they don't have to do the drugs. They don't have to do the guns. You've got to put money into capacity building, partnerships, wraparound supports, operations and management. You know, I think Mike is going to cut me off, so I'll stop there. But what I'm going to say is that ultimately, when we talk about could the community be capacitated to do the things that the police do, I believe the answer is yes. But I believe that we have not even started to put a drop in the bucket of the amount of resources that are necessary to do that. But even as we speak, I promise you this, there are people right now under the radar, right, who are actually having the types of conversations at the level of trust of somebody saying, hey, my young person just told me it's about to go off on this block. I don't want it to happen. Keep my name out of it. And a certain person can then go to the police, a trusted police precinct, and maybe it's the commander there, and say, this is going to go off. Can you just have somebody show up there, not to make arrests, not to do that, but just to be a presence and calm it down. And that type of stuff is happening, but that type of stuff is not being invested in, and that type of stuff is not even necessarily wanted, I think, at the highest levels at the NYPD, and that's a problem.
Thank you, Rubén. Well, thanks to all of you. I mean, it's such a rich discussion, and I guess I'd like to start us off taking off from really all of your presentations. Certainly, the last few points Rubén made. He cited Pat Sharkey's research in his book Uneasy Peace, makes this connection to the power of not-for-profit neighborhood-based organizations to reduce crime, and that was evident in Liz's presentation about the efficacy of a lot of these civil society community-based programs. Anna talked about the neighborhood-based probation and neons and arches, and David referenced the same sort of research, and we know how to do stuff better. But I do want to spend a minute at first at a high level, because a number of you have touched on this. I mean, what we're all talking about in different ways, and you know, David sort of set the context for this sort of political paralysis, is how, you know, none of you are really talking about doing something on the margins. Right. I mean, if we are really going to increase the capacity of neighborhoods, of civil society, of community to start doing this, and Rubén started mentioning it, you know, this is more than just a couple of small grants. I mean, this is a sea change in the kind of capacity that communities have, the sorts of resources they have access to. It requires a government ability to get them those resources and to find those resources. And as David has said, you know, this isn't something that happens overnight. So maybe we can just start out with you, Liz. Like, how do we, you know, given that we're not talking about a sort of a marginal program here, but a real shift in systemic resources and attention, how, I mean, just to go back to the what is to be done, I mean, how does that happen? And we can talk nationally or New York City, right? I mean, we have our own fiscal issues. Everyone sort of knows the politics. How do we think about this well beyond just, you know, here are some good programs, let's fund them? You're muted, Liz. Okay.
Yeah, that will be the motto. So that is absolutely the question. And, you know, the first thing I would just say is, and I thought, Rubén, you did like a fantastic job in showing this, but think about the budget of the city of New York. It's $100 billion. Even in pandemic times, the city has a level of resources and a network of services that they are to deliver that really no one else does, and at that scale. And the problem, I think, which is sort of what I was trying to say, is that we kind of know how to continue to invest in all those networks we've already built, that is the criminal justice system, but we just like throw spaghetti at the wall when it comes to other things. And so, the crisis management system, which has done a fantastic job, but it's small, and they've become the go-to for a whole range of things that are really probably beyond what they do, but is probably what Rubén does or other groups do. And so I think that at its heart, and this is about so much about government, and I say government because the money would come from government to lift up and link together and do all the things that Rubén was saying for nonprofits. But I think at its heart, it's about leadership and it's about political will. That is, somebody has to be willing to say, let's actually figure out, and frankly, we don't have to figure out every last thing. There's a lot of stuff we already know, but like, what are the 3 to 5 programs that we actually think will have, because we have the evidence, like Rubén had shown, will make a difference. And now it's not like there are that many neighborhoods. There are probably 15 neighborhoods that are really suffering and are really underinvested in, and where there are groups who know the neighborhoods well. And as Anna was saying, there are enormous assets, but it has to be linked together. And then the question is, so now let's assume you spend whatever it is, $1 billion, $2 billion, whatever it is that you're spending. How is that all actually getting organized and fed up? Like, how do you learn from one another, the Bronx from Brooklyn, the groups from one another, government from everybody else, so that we can use a mix of all these different things? Because it's not, at least in my view, just community groups or just police. It has to be some mix of that. I just think that the police and criminal justice component should be iteratively shrunk. So I think that there has to be like a government infrastructure that both supports and connects and permits kind of the learning. And the last thing I would just say, just to David's point, because I very much feel this, and I think, the likely next mayor, Eric Adams, says this quite a bit, which is, there's prevention and there's intervention. And intervention is what we do now, meaning the cops, and prevention we absolutely should do, but that's for later. And I would really push back on that, because actually prevention is for right now. You think about summer youth employment. That was like the first thing that was cut when shootings started to spike. But summer youth employment is a now strategy for stopping shootings. So, and there are other things as well. Lighting is a now strategy for stopping nighttime felony crime. So I think organization, political will are crucial.
Anna, David, you want to take a stab at this as well?
Sure. So let me piggyback on a couple of things that Liz has said, because it's true. And what I think is, and Adams's point is very important of intervention and prevention. What I will add on to what Liz said is that it has to be an and strategy, not an or strategy. So, and then you calibrate things as you need it. So to take the example of what we do as our role, the Department of Probation's role in this justice continuum is about behavior change, which is not what the police can do or should do, or CBOs in a way either, because we blend the two pieces, right, of the sort of law enforcement and, support system, that we can channel then all these components into this process of, of ultimate behavior change and investment in people at the same time, right, together, or build that capacity that Liz was talking about, or that sort of coalition. Where I would challenge us some too is that I don't think it's ultimately about existing programs, but people first. and then the programs follow, or at least the approaches or the interventions follow. Although, yes, we have proven effective, SYAP, ARCHES, other, some of Ruben's programs, any number of other things. Those do exist, but they have to be leveraged in a way that, can have that sort of broader impact and not be the first things that are cut, for sure. So I think it's, to what Rubén said before, people need connections, not corrections. Sometimes they need both, though. I will push back on you on that, because think about it, if you think about the way people then can change their own, the behaviors that lead to the, concentrations of violence or whatever, it takes time. And it takes both things to be able to do it. You can't do it by just saying, okay, we'll just wait until you're ready. No, we'll work for you until you're ready. But at the same time, if you keep doing this stuff, there's going to be consequences. To David's work is a lot about that. And so we have to be about and ultimately.
And so that, David, now I'll go to Rubén. So David, how do we thread this needle?
I don't know, and I don't know that we're going to. Right, this is my point. I think, I started by saying the conversation that I'm seeing in the cities that I'm familiar with and nationally, it doesn't feel like this conversation at all. Right, this is a really sensible conversation that we're having, and Rubén, I was ranting, and I apologize for making Mike do the handoff. That was not polite. No disrespect intended. Nor here. I want to ask you a question. You presented something like a funding transition plan for the city of New York to accomplish some of the things that we're all talking about. How much time did you put into that? Is that a life's work, or did you put that together for this symposium or something in between, or what have you?
The concept is my life's work. That actual presentation, I'll be honest, I did that about 20 minutes before this presentation.
So I sort of suspected that, and honestly, for the point I want to make, I was hoping that was true. I haven't seen the equivalent of that in any city around the country that is dealing with this stuff. I think including New York City. And it's not so much that we can't figure this stuff out. Everybody here knows what they're talking about, and we won't all agree with each other. But I think we could probably find an 80% middle that would be enough common ground that we could do a whole lot better than we're doing right now. I don't see this conversation at the city level or at the national level actually being driven by people who know what they're talking about. I see the right and the left especially engaging with the violence spike in terms of what it means politically rather than what it means in terms of people's lives. It's all about who's going to own the problem and how we're going to blame somebody else for the problem, and what the narrative of the rising, the spike in violence means. If I hear one more time people talking about, the meaning of the rise in violence, I'm going to throw up. People are dying all over the country, and it's not just that people are playing politics with it. All they can see is that it's politics. And I believe, as Liz said, that there can be a transition, an iterative way to something very different than what we've got. And I think even as narrow as the evidence base is, the evidence is there to know that we can do much better and do much less harm than we do now. I think we know enough to do that. What I don't see is any kind of systemic, sustained engagement with what that would mean or how to get there, or, to Liz's point, the leadership that it would take to actually navigate this. And what I find is these conversations amongst people who do this work and who know what they're talking about don't have much in common with what's actually going on where the conversation is happening publicly and where the decisions are getting made.
Rubén, you want to respond to that, and then, or anything else you want to, and then we'll go to one or two audience questions.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple things. I mean, one, I don't disagree with the both and as far as what is the intervention needed in the now, right? Because, you know, you could take $1 billion from the NYPD budget and put it into like DYCD or ACS, and you'd probably get crap, right? You like, I mean, you might get some good stuff, but you're not going to get an intervention at the level that's going to actually address those who are committing the worst violence. And I do believe that in the present moment, that often takes a both and strategy. Something that I saw in Boston in the late 90s, where the clergy and the police would, or the police actually gave the clergy the heads up, right? And they said, we're gonna take down this crew, you know, within the next month. And we're gonna give you the lead to go out and try to get whoever you can on board. And if you vouch for them, if they've stopped doing what they're doing, or they're willing to get into job programs, GED programs, whatever, we'll go light on them. And those who wouldn't, you know, sometimes had to be taken out of the community. And that's, you know, I'm not naive enough to say, oh yeah, every single person, if given the opportunity, is going to turn around right now, right? And so I think that can happen, right? And I do think that it should be brought to scale. One of the things that I'm worried about with this whole both and thing, though, is that if you kind of look at the trajectory that the NYPD is on, right, there's this whole move, and you saw it last week, right, to sort of have a kinder, gentler face, and we're going to have neighborhood coordination officers, and we're going to do more PAL stuff, and we're going to do all this stuff, which, to be honest, is just window dressing, because that's not reaching any of the young people who are involved in violence and involved in crews either, right? And I think there's a danger of saying, well, yeah, let's just, it's like Liz said, there's kind of these streams of funding, or where funding goes, they sort of get carved out, and it's just the lowest point of gravity, and that's where everything flows, right? So it's much easier to fund the NYPD to do basketball and community centers than to fund the community, because the community has trouble managing the money, right? We got 10 million from the DA's office, and it almost killed us, and that was over a 5-year period, and you know all about that, Mike, right? But we have people on the call, right? Reverend Maurice Winley and his team. You got a group right there, and you got 2 brothers there who grew up in the St. Nicholas projects, and, you know, used to be shooters, and they're all up there in the projects. I would guarantee you that if you could just take that one precinct, right, and say, what if you had Maurice and his team scale them up, right, to do enough work around that housing development, I guarantee you shootings would go down, right? But as far as the actual budgets that we're talking about, right, you're talking about a team of people that, even with a decent budget that they have right now, their credible messengers are doing the street outreach and the violence interruption, basically on top of everything else they're doing, just because it's on their heart to do it. But I do think that what the answer is that you can get police commanders of goodwill and community members of goodwill who are going to say, like, we are going to work hardcore together in the moment. But I think it has to be always with this goal of, how do you keep on shaving down all the public safety budgets, even honors, right? Even though I like what they're doing and love what they're doing, but hey, probation started as a faith-based volunteer who just went and tried to pull kids out of jail, and I think it needs to go back to that, right? But we haven't. I don't think we've had any serious conversations about what it takes to scale the efforts. And I think one part of it, right, really, and this is my passion now, is the organizational capacity of people of color, credible messenger-led grassroots organizations, right? Because there is so much extra that we do, and a lot of times we do not have the containers to adequately do more, because we're already cracked.
Yeah. Amen.
So I want to, I mean, time really goes so fast during these things. I want to make sure to get there are a bunch of really thoughtful questions from the audience. A couple of them are on bail reform and sort of rethinking corrections, for which we need clearly another panel, not a rush thing. But there is a question about essentially, how a number of you have sort of mentioned programs at work, and there are obviously people who are in or run those programs. How do we involve them in this conversation, right? So it's not just a bunch of sort of experts or policy folks, right? How do we involve, whether it's people who are doing credible messenger work or alternative work? How do they participate in this conversation in a sort of meaningful way? Anyone? Yeah.
I'll step into this, although
Sure.
I think other people are much more, qualified to answer. But just based on what I've seen sort of from the government side, I think people all over the city are already doing this. And I think every single time the city government says, let's have a conversation about what safety means to you, the community kind of metaphorically like rolls its eyes, like, stop asking me. I mean, I just think there's fatigue. There's already incredible work being done, and there are already organizations on the ground and federations of organizations on the ground. I mentioned Brownsville Safety Alliance. I think Neighborhood Stat provides a kind of organizing mechanism for bringing, nonprofits together with city services, powered by kind of neighborhood vision, very focused on identifying what the problems are and what the solutions are. But I think the problem is exactly what Rubén says, which is the organizations don't have the infrastructure to run at scale. So that needs to big time be provided. And there's no real infrastructure for connecting the needs of residents, the services of nonprofits, and the enormous capacity of government to actually deliver if it was pointed and organized in the right way. One police precinct commander said to me, people come to me because they don't know how to get their water turned back on, and I'm the one who's doing that. That's terrible. That means that the precinct commander is essentially the civilian mini mayor of that neighborhood. And what I think sort of should happen is that there should be a deputy mayor for justice policy and operations, who is able on the government side to bring all these resources together, and who's able to organize and support neighborhood organizations, knit them together and provide them the kind of like resources, cross-learning, and then feeding up so that everybody can kind of see how to do this.
So we literally have 2 minutes left. So I want to close out, and then we'll end after the last one speaks. Each of you, really in 30 seconds, if you're talking to the mayor, whether it's Mayor Adams or Mayor Sliwa, as Liz says, likely Adams, and Adams sort of ran on issues of safety, right? You have 30 seconds to really basically tell him what should be done. Like, here's what I think you think he should do. What do you tell him, right? In 30 seconds. Rubén, do you mind starting us?
Sure, I'd say one, go dig deep and find the precincts where commanding officers are already working at that very deep level with community members, like to really, really stop violence, and then reward them. don't transfer them, right? Don't don't punish them for not making enough arrests. Lift them up and make them the model and tell other precincts to do that. And number two, just start shaving, I don't know, 1%, 2%, 3%, 5% each year off of every criminal justice budget and find a way to get it into community, and tell the private foundations and the corporations to pitch in a whole bunch of unrestricted money to build the community capacity and the organizational capacity of these organizations.
Thanks. Anna?
I'm going to follow Liz's lead on this one, because I think there's got to be much more centralized, not centralized, but a person in City Hall that is really has both authority and responsibility for the coordination and the channeling of all these issues that we've been talking about, and leveraging all the sort of justice agencies in a way that can, you know, promote this kind of efforts that Rubén is talking about, that, you know, and that we've been sharing tonight.
Thank you, Anna. David, you have 30 seconds with the mayor.
Yeah, so I'm in vociferous agreement with all of my friends here. Sort of, if we could get Liz's deputy mayor, as endorsed by Anna, and if we could get Rubén's charge to the incoming administration, what one finds is there's tremendous knowledge about how to do this work in different ways at the front lines right now. There's also a lot of scholarship and research on how to do that and what that means, that supports that we can do this. And to vamp off something that Rubén said about Boston and then about his own attitude toward this, you don't find the battle lines about ideology drawn at the front lines among people who actually do this work. They know better, and they know each other, and they respect each other, and the good ones work together. And if we could tap into that and build it. So what I'd add is do everything that you've just heard, and take Rubén's $86 million or whatever it was, and use that as a starting point for building up existing practice and building the capacity we've been talking about.
Thank you, David. Liz, I know you offered to not go, but we're out of time. So you only have 20 seconds with the mayor, and then we'll close out.
So I would blow out, deepen, and expand the neighborhood stat model, which brings together is resident-led and brings together city agencies, nonprofits, and others to do problem solving directly at the neighborhood level in a really regular way, in the same way that the police department does its problem solving in CompStat. And then I would use that deputy mayor to pressure test every single dollar and find out how much safety, how much of a thriving city is that dollar buying, whether it's a criminal justice dollar or a summer youth employment dollar.
Right. Well, thank you all so much. Such a great conversation. We could obviously keep going on. We can't, we're out of time. Thank you to the audience, especially obviously to the panelists for their thoughtful presentations. We'll see you all soon. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.